Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. Legally, the deed had already been in Mark and Lena's names since Ben passed. Changing the locks needed no permission. It was the cruelty of the timing that stung. She even let out a short, triumphant laugh as the final cylinder clicked. My daughter-in-law once laughed as she changed the locks on the house where I raised my son, thinking she had finally erased me. She humiliated me in front of neighbors, told me I had failed as a mother and wife, and my own son stood silent. But what she never imagined was that I carried a secret strong enough to turn her laughter into tears. I had over $10 million, enough to buy the very neighborhood she worshipped. My name is Nora. I am 64, and this is the story of how I stopped being invisible and reclaimed my place. I didn't call the police. I refused to stain Ava's graduation day with a report against her stepmother, and my hip bruise could wait until morning. The June sun was already warm when I pulled into the parking lot of Maple Grove High School. I had chosen my best dress, the navy blue with small white flowers, the one I had worn at my husband Ben's funeral 3 years ago. It was the nicest thing I owned, and I pressed the fabric smooth before stepping out of my car. My knees ached a little, but I felt a quiet pride. Today was Ava's day, and nothing, not even Lena's sharp tongue, was going to keep me away from celebrating my granddaughter's graduation. The backyard reception was already crowded when I walked through the gate. White tents stretched across the lawn, tables heavy with catered food, flowers tucked into every corner. I paused, remembering when Ben and I used to host birthdays here with just a sheet cake and a cooler of soda. Now the house no longer felt like mine. It belonged to my son Mark and his wife Lena, or more accurately to Lena, who ran it like a showroom meant to impress. I spotted Ava across the yard, radiant in her white dress, her dark hair pinned back with the pearl clips I had given her that morning. She saw me and ran over, throwing her arms around me. "Grandma Nora, you came?" She whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. You know how Mom gets." I hugged her tightly, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, the same brand I used to buy when she was little and slept over at my apartment. "I wouldn't miss this for anything, sweetheart. Your grandfather would be so proud." She smiled, eyes shining with unshed tears, but before we could say more, Lena's voice cut across the yard. "Ava, honey, the photographer wants pictures. Family pictures." Ava's hand tightened on mine, then she slipped away reluctantly. I knew what family meant in Lena's vocabulary. It meant everyone except me. I stood off to the side, pretending to admire the flower arrangements, listening to the chatter of women in bright sundresses. Their jewelry caught the light, their laughter rose easily. I could feel their eyes flick toward me, measuring my thrift store dress against their designer outfits. I pressed my purse closer to my side and forced myself to breathe evenly. When the photographer called for the Whitmans to gather, I stepped forward hesitantly. Ava looked at me with pleading eyes, but Lena slid between us smoothly, her manicured hand resting on my son's arm. "I think we'll keep this one to immediate family," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. Mark looked away, not meeting mine. I stopped in my tracks, heat rushing to my face as guests shifted uncomfortably. Ava's smile faltered, but she stayed quiet, caught between us. I tried to brush it off, chatting with a neighbor near the buffet, but I could feel Lena's presence behind every word. She steered people away from me, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry dropping comments about how I insisted on wearing the same old dress to every occasion. I sipped from a plastic cup of lemonade, willing myself not to react. By evening, as the crowd thinned, I helped gather empty glasses. It was the only way I knew to feel useful. Near the patio, I overheard Lena speaking to one of her friends. She shows up looking like she bought her clothes at Goodwill. She inserts herself into conversations. It's embarrassing. I froze the tray in my hands, trembling. My heart hammered in my chest, but something colder than hurt was rising inside me. I stepped closer. Lena turned her face, registering a flicker of guilt, then settling into annoyance. Nora, I didn't see you there. I looked at her calmly. I'm sure you didn't. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. She moved closer, her perfume cloying in the evening air. How dare you speak to me like that in my house at my daughter's party? Your house? I thought, though I didn't say it aloud. She kept going, her voice climbing. You've never understood, have you? Ben is gone. This house, this family, even Ava, none of it belongs to you. You are here because Mark pities you. You failed as a mother, as a wife, as a daughter. You have nothing. You are nothing. Gasps rippled through the small group of guests who still lingered. I saw Ava standing near the doorway, her face pale. I tried to steady myself, but then Lena shoved me. It was not a hard push, but I was near the edge of the patio. My feet slipped on the smooth stone, and I went down hard, my hips slamming against the ground, pain jolting through me. My purse spilled open coins and lipstick scattering across the concrete. For a moment the world went silent. I could hear my own breathing harsh in my ears, the taste of blood where I had bitten my tongue. Guests stared, some with hands over their mouths. Someone's glass slipped and shattered. Lena stood over me, her chest rising and falling, her expression caught between triumph and surprise. Maybe now you finally understand your place, she hissed. I pressed my palms to the ground, pushed myself up to sit. My dress was torn at the knee dirt, smudging the fabric. I felt strangely calm. The shame and anger that had simmered for years crystallized into something sharper. I looked up at Lena, meeting her eyes. I brushed the grit from my hands, gathered my breath, and said slowly, clearly, "Poor people can surprise you." The words landed heavier than I expected. The chatter stilled the air itself, seemed to pause. Lena's face shifted from red to white, then back again, as if she could not decide whether to explode or retreat. Ava's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. For the first time in years, I felt no fear, only clarity. I reached for my scattered purse, ignoring the whispers, ignoring the hands that offered to help me up. I did not need their pity. I straightened slowly, every ache in my body, a reminder of what I had endured and of what I was done enduring. And as I stood there, dress torn, hip throbbing, watching Lena's forced smile crumble in front of her carefully chosen guests, I knew this night would not end the way she thought it would. This was the moment something shifted, not only for her, but for me. The party lights flickered on as the sun dropped below the trees, and I turned away from her, steadying myself on my feet. My voice still echoed in my ears, those 5 words that had left her pale and uncertain, words that felt like the beginning of something I had not allowed myself in a very long time. A beginning that was mine alone. I drove back to my apartment in Maple Grove with my hands tight on the steering wheel, the hum of the engine filling the silence that had fallen since I left the party. My hip throbbed with every bump in the road, and when I pulled into the parking lot, the ache had settled deep into my bones. The torn hem of my dress brushed against my leg as I climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. Inside the beige walls of my small apartment greeted me the same walls I had stared at every day for the last 3 years. I dropped my purse on the counter and eased myself into the armchair that had once belonged in the living room of the house Ben and I shared. I lifted the fabric of my dress to examine the scrape on my knee. The skin was raw and tender, and I dabbed at it with a wet cloth. My hip had started to bruise, the purple spreading like spilled ink. I let my head fall back against the chair and closed my eyes. Memories pressed in. The last time I wore this dress had been at Ben's funeral in 2021. That day I had felt as if my heart had been split open, but at least then the grief was honest. Tonight was different. Tonight the wound came from the people who should have protected me. Ben had been my anchor. He built his landscaping business from scratch, dirt under his nails and hope in his eyes. We never had much, but we made a life together. When he died, the world tilted. Mark had been supportive at first, calling, often stopping by with Ava, making sure I ate. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the calls grew fewer. The visits became brief, polite check-ins more than conversations. And then Lena began to redraw the lines, placing me further and further from the center of their lives. I pressed the cloth harder against my bruise and felt a surge of anger so clean it startled me. Anger not just at Lena, but at myself for letting it go on for so long. Every exclusion, every look, every cutting remark I had swallowed them all in the name of keeping peace. Peace had cost me my dignity. The phone on the counter buzzed, its screen lighting up in the dim room. Ava's name? I hurried to answer, my voice soft. "Sweetheart, are you home?" Her voice was choked with tears. "Grandma, I am so sorry. I can't believe Mom did that to you. Are you hurt?" I looked at the dark bruise on my hip and the scrape on my knee, but forced steadiness into my voice. "Just a little sore, nothing I can't handle." She sniffled, and I could hear the weight of guilt in her silence. "She always talks about you when you are not around. She says you are too dependent on us, that you never built a life of your own after Grandpa died. She says you don't understand boundaries." I swallowed hard, the words slicing deeper than the fall I had taken hours before. "And you, Ava, do you believe her?" "Never, Grandma. I love you." "Dad loves you too. He just lets her control the narrative." My chest tightened at her words. I pictured Mark, my only son, standing silently as his wife rewrote our family story. I wanted to be angry at him, but all I felt was tired. Ava's voice grew small. "She says you are jealous of their success, that you resent her for giving us stability you never could." I leaned back, staring at the cracked ceiling, and forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. Stability. She had no idea what Ben and I sacrificed to give Mark a childhood free from want. She had no idea what I carried silently so he could go to college, so Ava could grow up with opportunities. Ava's sob pulled me back. "Grandma, you know none of that is true, right? You know I love you." I pressed the phone close. "I know, sweetheart, and I love you more than anything. You are the best part of this family." She exhaled shakily. "Please don't give up on us." I promised her I would not, though my heart knew something had to change. After we hung up, the apartment felt even quieter than before. I stood and carried the dress to my small bedroom. Under the yellow light of the lamp, I traced the tear at the knee where the fabric had split on the patio stone. I could still hear the gasp of the guests, the smug tilt of Lena's chin, the silence of my son. I ran my fingers along the frayed threads, each one a reminder of humiliation. I laid the dress across the bed and stared at it. I realized I had spent years folding myself smaller to fit into a space Lena allowed, pretending it was enough to be tolerated. Tonight had drawn a line that could not be erased. For the first time in years, my shame was joined by something stronger, a determination that filled my chest and steadied my hands. I walked back to the armchair and sat my hip throbbing, but I ignored it. I picked up a notebook from the side table, one I usually used for grocery lists and budget notes. I opened to a blank page and stared at it, the pen trembling in my hand. All my life I had been practical, cautious, quiet. But I understood in that moment that silence had only protected the wrong people. It had protected Lena's cruelty, Mark's passivity, and the lie that I was powerless. I wrote a single sentence across the top of the page. No more. The pen dug into the paper, the words underlined twice. I sat back, breathing steadily, and for the first time since Ben's death, I felt something I thought I had lost. A spark of defiance. It burned small but steady, and I knew it was only the beginning. I turned off the lamp and let the room fall into darkness. The city hum outside the window carried on as it always had, but inside me something shifted. The bruises would fade, the fabric could be mended, but the decision I had made tonight would not be undone. I lay down carefully, my hip protesting, and pulled the blanket over myself. The torn dress still lay on the chair, its ripped fabric catching the faint light from the street lamp. I closed my eyes with that image imprinted in my mind, the symbol of all that had been broken, and the promise that I would not remain broken with it. The next morning I woke with stiffness in my hip and the faint imprint of determination still burning in my chest. Sunlight spilled across the beige carpet of my Maple Grove apartment. I pushed myself out of bed slowly and shuffled to the closet where a small fireproof box sat tucked behind a stack of old blankets. I had not opened it in years. My hands trembled as I set it on the kitchen table and turned the key. The familiar smell of paper and metal rose up when the lid clicked open. Inside were neatly folded bank statements, legal papers, and a leather folder embossed with the name of a law firm in Boston. My throat tightened at the sight of the first document, a letter dated 2010 from the office of attorney Harold Whitfield. It had arrived in the mail on a gray March morning, and I could still remember Ben holding it with cautious hands. I closed my eyes and the memory flooded back. The kitchen of our old house smelled of coffee and toast. Ben sat across from me at the table, his hair streaked with early gray, but his eyes sharp with disbelief. Evelyn Hartwell, my father's cousin, had passed away in California. I had met her only a handful of times at family reunions. She had no children, no living siblings, and somehow my name had ended up on her will as the sole heir. The attorney's voice over the phone had been crisp and businesslike. Mrs. Whitman, the estate is significant. I remembered the way Ben's hand had closed over mine. He was a man who had worked his whole life with soil under his fingernails. He had built his landscaping company from nothing, mowing lawns after long shifts until he could hire a crew of his own. Money to him had always been something earned inch by inch. The idea that a fortune could fall into our laps was something neither of us knew how to process. We flew to San Francisco for the reading of the will. I had sat stiffly in a leather chair as numbers and accounts were listed. Stocks, real estate investments, trust funds that had grown untouched for decades. By the time the lawyer finished, my hands were damp with sweat. The figure was more than anything I had imagined. Enough to erase every worry we had ever carried. Enough to transform our lives overnight. That night in the hotel, Ben poured us each a small glass of wine, and we sat on the balcony overlooking the city lights. He said softly, "We cannot let this money change us. We worked too hard to become who we are." I nodded, my chest tight with fear and excitement. We agreed to invest carefully, to let it grow quietly, and to live as we always had. No new cars, no sudden moves, no flaunting. We called ourselves stealth millionaires and laughed like conspirators with a secret. Back at home, we met with a young financial advisor named Will Chen. He wore sharp suits, but his eyes were kind and he listened as we explained what we wanted. Security, stability, but no show. He set up diversified investments trusts and accounts that would build quietly while we continued to live off Ben's business income and my salary as a teacher. Every quarter, Will sent us updates, and every quarter we smiled at the numbers and tucked them away. We never told Mark. We never told anyone. The years passed. We paid off the mortgage but still clipped coupons. We helped Mark with his college tuition but told him we had saved for it. When Ava was born, I bought baby clothes from discount racks, while quietly knowing she would never have to struggle for opportunity. Ben and I would wink at each other when neighbors remarked on how modestly we lived. It was our secret one that felt almost romantic. When Ben grew sick, the money meant he had the best care, private rooms, and treatments without the crushing fear of debt. In those final months, I held his hand and promised him I would guard what we had built, both the family and the fortune. He squeezed my fingers with the last of his strength and whispered, "Do not let them take your worth." The sound of the memory made my throat ache. I opened my eyes and looked at the papers spread before me on the table. 13 years had passed since Evelyn's will, 3 years since Ben's death. The numbers had grown with the markets and careful management. I pulled out the most recent statement from Chen Financial Group. My heart raced as I scanned the lines. The total balance stood just shy of $10 million. $10 million. I said the words aloud, testing their weight in the air of my small apartment. The walls around me were thin, the carpet worn, yet I was sitting on more wealth than most people could dream of. Lena had sneered at my dress, laughed at my apartment, called me a burden. She had no idea. None of them did. I leaned back in the chair, pressing the paper flat against the table. With $10 million, I could buy not just a house, but in half the neighborhood in Riverside Heights. I could pay Ava's education through medical school if she wanted. I could travel, donate, build something lasting. For years, I had chosen silence, convinced that secrecy was protection. Now I realized that silence had become permission. I had allowed Lena to humiliate me because she believed I had no power. The bruise on my hip throbbed as I stood, but the pain felt like fuel. I went to the small drawer where I kept envelopes and pulled out one addressed to Will Chen. I slid the latest statements inside and pressed my hand against the flap. Tomorrow I would call him. Tomorrow I would ask him to prepare the documents I needed. I would no longer live like a woman scraping by. I walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot. The cars sat in neat rows, the faint hum of traffic drifting in from the highway. Somewhere across town, Lena was likely laughing with her friends, retelling the story of how she pushed me down and silenced me. She did not yet know the truth. She did not know that the woman she dismissed as a burden could buy the neighborhood she worshipped. I let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the table. The papers lay there quietly, but to me, they glowed with possibility. $10 million was not just money. It was freedom. It was respect. It was the weapon I had never allowed myself to wield. I closed the fireproof box and turned the key with a steady hand. The weight of it was no longer a secret pressing on me. It was a promise. I set it carefully back in the closet, feeling taller than I had in years. The day had left me bruised and shaken, but tonight I felt something else rising. A plan was taking shape, one I could no longer ignore. I slipped into bed, the edges of determination sharper than the pain in my hip. Tomorrow I would make the first call. tonight, I let the silence of the room wrap around me, my heart steady with the knowledge that everything was about to change. The next day, I left my apartment early, restless after a night of staring at the ceiling with plans and memories running in circles through my mind. The morning air was cool as I drove toward the old neighborhood, the one where I had spent more than 20 years raising Mark, where the house had once been mine and Ben's before it became Lena's stage. I told myself I only wanted to see the flowers we had planted along the fence line years ago to remind myself of what used to be. But as I turned onto Willow Lane, my chest tightened. A white van sat in the driveway, bold lettering on the side that read, "Anderson Locksmith Service." I slowed my car and pulled to the curb across the street, my heart thudding. A man in a uniform stood by the front door with a toolkit while Lena hovered near him with a clipboard in her hand. The sight hit me like ice water down my back. I knew what she was doing. I rolled down my window just enough to lift my phone and snap a picture, careful not to draw attention. The click of the camera sounded louder than it was. My palms were damp on the steering wheel. I had suspected Lena wanted me gone permanently, but seeing the locksmith drilling into the door frame of the house where Ben and I had once carved our initials in the wood felt like a final erasure. A voice startled me. "Nora." I turned to see Mrs. Kaplan, the neighbor from 2 houses down, standing by her mailbox with a small dog on a leash. She was a kind woman with sharp eyes that missed little. She walked closer and leaned toward my window. "Did you know about this?" she whispered. "Lena told me last night that they needed more space, that it was time to set boundaries." Boundaries. The word carried the same sting it had when Ava had repeated it on the phone. I forced a tight smile and shook my head. "Thank you, Mrs. Kaplan." She patted my window frame and gave me a look that was equal parts sympathy and disapproval. Then she walked on the dog, tugging at the leash. I turned back in time to see the locksmith finish his work. He stepped away, scribbled something on the clipboard, and handed the pen back to Lena. She signed quickly, then handed over cash folded neatly in an envelope. When he left, she lingered on the front step, turning the new brass key in her hand. Then she looked out over the yard with a smile that was smug and victorious. She straightened her shoulders, locked the door, and walked back inside with the air of someone who had just sealed a deal. The sight of her triumphant smile felt like a nail driven into my chest. It was more than replacing a lock. It was her declaration that I no longer belonged, that I was cut off not only from the house, but from the memories rooted in its walls. I remembered carrying a toddler Mark through that very door after his first trip to the zoo, remembered Ben painting the front porch green one summer while I brought him lemonade. Now the paint had been stripped, the door was stark black, and Lena's hand held the key. I sat frozen in my car for a long time, staring at the house. Cars past a delivery truck rumbled by, but I barely noticed. The locksmith's van disappeared down the street, leaving only silence. My knuckles were white around my phone, the photo of Lena, with the clipboard already stored in my camera roll. Evidence. Proof that her cruelty was no longer subtle, no longer deniable. At last, I started the car and pulled away slowly. My chest ached as I drove through the neighborhood, passing the elementary school where I used to volunteer at book fairs, the park where Mark had learned to ride his bike, the church where we had celebrated Christmas Eve. Each landmark felt like a ghost. By the time I reached the main road, my throat was tight with unshed tears. Back at the apartment, I dropped my purse on the counter and sank into the armchair. I pulled up the photo on my phone, staring at Lena's smile frozen in the morning light. It was the smile of someone who believed she had won, who believed she had stripped me of my place for good. The sight steadied me more than it hurt. If she thought a lock and a smirk could end me, she had no idea what was coming. I leaned back, pressing the phone against my chest, and closed my eyes. The house might have been hers to decorate, the locks hers to change, but the truth rested quietly in my closet in that fireproof box. $10 million. Enough to buy her half the neighborhood, enough to make her smug little victories meaningless. For the first time in years, I felt the tremor of power under my skin. Not the kind that shouted or shoved, but the kind that waited patiently, that chose its moment carefully. Lena had drawn a line with her locksmith's drill. She believed it was permanent, but she had no idea she had just marked the beginning of mine. I set the phone on the table and sat still, letting the weight of it settle. I had the proof I needed: the bruise on my hip, the torn dress, and now the photo of her locking me out of my own history. My path was clear. I was done being erased. The locks she changed would not keep me out. They would only remind me of how far I was about to step beyond her reach. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, but inside my head, there was a new rhythm, steady and certain, like a drumbeat pushing me forward. The plan was no longer just an idea scribbled in a notebook. It was real, it was necessary, and it was mine. The following morning, I put on a navy blazer that had hung in my closet for years, smoothed my hair, and boarded the early train into Chicago. The ride was steady and familiar, the skyline growing larger as the train pulled closer to Union Station. I felt both nervous and sharp, as if I were stepping into a role I had forgotten I could play. The offices of Chen Financial were located on the 23rd floor of a glass tower near the river. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive cologne, and when I walked in, the receptionist looked up with recognition. The night before, I called Chen Financial and left a voicemail. At dawn, his assistant confirmed a morning slot. "Mrs. Whitman, good morning. Mr. Chen is expecting you." I thanked her and sat for only a moment before William Chen appeared. He looked the same as when Ben and I first met him more than a decade ago, his black hair now streaked with silver, his tie knotted with precision. He smiled warmly, but I noticed his eyes lingered on the faint bruise near my cheekbone. I lifted my chin slightly, unwilling to explain. "Nora, it has been too long," he said as he extended his hand. "Let's go into my office." His office overlooked the river sunlight bouncing off the water and filling the room with a glow. He motioned for me to sit at a polished oak table. A folder already lay open, thick with printed statements and charts. I settled into the chair and folded my hands. "I need to make some changes, William. Big ones." He nodded slowly, as if he had sensed this moment coming. "I have your most recent portfolio summary here. As of this quarter, your net worth stands at over $10 million. About half is in long-term investments, the rest in diversified funds and liquid assets." He tapped the papers with a slim pen. "You have considerable flexibility, but I must admit, you have lived very modestly considering what is here." I leaned forward, feeling the steadiness in my own voice. "I have lived modestly because it served a purpose. That purpose is gone now. I am ready to use what I have built." He studied me for a moment, then asked, "What do you have in mind?" I took a breath. "I want to purchase a property in Riverside Heights. I want to make a cash offer. Full price, no contingencies." His eyebrows lifted. "That is certainly possible." "Which property?" I pulled a folded listing from my purse and slid it across the table. "A 4-bedroom colonial listed at $850,000. I want it. I do not want to wait." He opened the paper, nodded at the details, then looked back at me. "This is well within your reach. With a cash offer, you could close in as little as 2 weeks. Good, I said. Prepare the necessary transfers. He scribbled a note. And you mentioned changes beyond real estate. I sat straighter. I want a trust for my granddaughter Ava, covering all her education expenses, her living costs, her future opportunities. I want her to never worry about money. I want it structured so it cannot be touched by anyone else, not even her parents. William's face softened with approval. That is very wise. We can establish a dedicated educational trust with you as the trustee. Disbursements can begin immediately for tuition and housing. Do you want this to be disclosed to her or remain anonymous? The trust disburses at the start of each semester, excluding any line items already prepaid to the bursar, and covers approved housing, books, fees, and a modest meal plan stipend. Anonymous? I said quickly, then paused. At least for now. She will know in time, but I want it to come as a relief, not a weapon her mother can twist. He leaned back in his chair. You have carried this wealth quietly for many years. May I ask what prompted the change? I looked out the window at the river and thought of Lena standing on the porch with her new keys. I thought of her smirk, her shove at the graduation party, her laughter. My jaw tightened. Let's just say I have realized staying silent has done nothing to protect me. It only protected the wrong people. He nodded slowly, accepting my answer without pressing. Very well. I will arrange the transfers for the property and begin the paperwork for Ava's trust. I will also prepare liquidity options should you want to move funds quickly. Thank you, William. We sat in silence for a moment, the air heavy with the importance of what had been set in motion. He finally said, You know, Nora, most people in your position would have been spending this money years ago. Vacations, luxury cars, second homes. You never once touched it. Because I believed love was stronger when unmeasured by money, I said quietly, but now I know dignity requires proof. When I left the office, the city air felt sharper, brighter. I clutched the folder with the property details against my chest as I walked back toward the station. For the first time in years, I felt like I was not moving through life as a shadow. I had made a decision, and decisions had power. On the train ride home, I stared out the window at the blur of rooftops and highways. I imagined Ava moving into her dorm without the weight of debt. I imagined myself walking through the front door of the Colonial in Riverside Heights, the key warm in my hand. I imagined Lena's face when she learned the truth. When the train pulled into Maple Grove, I rose with a calm I had not felt in years. The papers in my bag rustled as if whispering promises. I knew this was only the beginning. The locks on Willow Lane might have been changed, but I had just unlocked something far greater. The following afternoon, I drove to State University. The campus spread wide across rolling lawns and brick buildings that carried the smell of freshly cut grass. Students crossed in groups, their laughter echoing against the stone walls, their futures unwritten. I parked near the administration building, gripping the handle of my purse tighter than usual. Inside, the hallways smelled faintly of paper and polish, the sound of printers humming behind closed doors. A small sign pointed me toward the bursar's office. The woman behind the desk looked up as I entered. She was middle-aged with short dark hair and glasses perched low on her nose. Her nameplate read, Mrs. Rodriguez. I stepped forward, clearing my throat. Good afternoon, I am here about my granddaughter's account. Her name is Ava Whitman. Mrs. Rodriguez's face lit with recognition. Ah, yes, Ava. Bright young woman. She has already submitted her FERPA release form so we can discuss her records with you. Please have a seat. I lowered myself into the chair across from her desk, my hips still stiff but less painful than the day before. Mrs. Rodriguez clicked through a computer screen, then turned the monitor slightly toward me. As you can see, Ava has merit-based aid and a small scholarship, but there is still a significant remaining balance. Tuition room board books. If she covers it through loans, she will graduate with debt close to $80,000. The number hung in the air like a weight. I thought of Ava's soft voice on the phone, her tears when she told me what her mother said, the fear she carried of being a burden. I felt my resolve harden. That will not be necessary, I said. I would like to pay her balance in full, not just this semester, but for all her years here. Everything she needs. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes widened slightly, then softened. That is very generous. I will need to prepare some forms, but yes, it can be arranged. Do you want it recorded as an anonymous scholarship or a direct family payment? Anonymous, I replied firmly. I want her to feel relief, not obligation. She nodded, printing a set of documents and sliding them toward me. I signed where she indicated my hand, steady each stroke of the pen, like a promise fulfilled. When I handed the papers back, she smiled warmly. We will update her account this afternoon. By the end of the day, her balance will be 0. I thanked her and stood clutching my purse to my chest. As I stepped back into the sunlight of the quad, I drew in a deep breath that felt lighter than any I had taken in years. For once, I was not just surviving, I was building. By the time I reached home, my phone buzzed with an incoming video call. Ava's face filled the screen, her eyes red but glowing. Grandma, did you do this? I opened my email and saw it a notice from the bursar's office. My balance is gone. It says 0. Is this real? I smiled, tears prickling at my own eyes. It is real, sweetheart. You are free to study without worry. She pressed her hands to her mouth, then dropped them with a shaky laugh. Grandma, you saved me. You have no idea what this means. I was already calculating how many shifts I would have to take at the diner, how many loans I would sign. And now it's gone. You saved me. Her voice broke into sobs, and I let her cry, watching the relief wash over her young face. In that moment, I felt the years of Lena's insults, the years of being dismissed and minimized fall away. They could say what they wanted about me, but Ava knew the truth. I had given her wings. When her tears quieted, she whispered, I love you more than anyone in this world. Thank you. I wiped my eyes quickly before she noticed. Focus on your classes, Ava. Make this a time of joy, not worry. She nodded, smiling through her tears. I will, Grandma. I promise. When the call ended, the apartment was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not emptiness, but peace. I walked to the closet and opened the fireproof box once more, laying the fresh receipts and copies of the trust paperwork alongside the other documents. The numbers no longer felt like distant figures on a page. They were alive now, shaping futures. I touched the corner of Ben's old photo that I kept tucked between the folders. His eyes looked back at me, kind and steady. You would be proud, I whispered. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. The bruise on my hip still ached, the torn dress still lay draped over the chair, but those things no longer defined me. I was not a burden. I was not powerless. I had just lifted a weight from my granddaughter's shoulders that Lena could never understand. The evening light spilled across the carpet as I closed the closet door. My reflection in the mirror showed a woman tired but resolute, eyes sharpened by something more than pain. This was only the beginning. I had more to do, more to claim, more to protect. Ava's future was secured, but mine was still waiting to be reclaimed. I sat in my armchair, the silence humming around me, and let myself breathe. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow I would take the next step. The next morning I drove into downtown Maple Grove, my hands steady on the wheel, though my heart beat heavier than usual. Mark's office was on the second floor of a brick building above a small coffee shop, the kind of place where accountants and lawyers kept modest practices. I parked across the street, gathered the folder from the passenger seat, and pressed it against my chest before walking inside. The receptionist looked up politely, her eyes flicking from my face to the bruise still fading on my cheek. I asked if Mark was available, and she made a quick call before pointing me to his office door. Mark stood when I entered, adjusting his tie as if bracing himself. "Mom," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "We should probably keep this short. Things are tense at home." I nodded and closed the door behind me. "I understand, Mark. That is why I came here instead of the house." He gestured toward a chair but kept pacing near his desk. "Look, Mom, Lena is upset. She feels like things are spinning out of control. She asked me to tell you that maybe we should have some space at least until everything calms down." The word struck me again, the same word Ava had whispered, the same word Lena had tossed around like a weapon. Space. I set the folder on his desk without speaking. He frowned, curious, and pulled it closer. When he opened it and scanned the first page, his expression shifted. His lips parted, but no words came out. He flipped to another page, his hands trembling. "Mom, what is this?" "These numbers. This says nearly $10 million. His voice cracked. "How long have you had this?" I sat still, watching the realization settle over him. "For years. Ben and I invested carefully after Evelyn Hartwell left me her estate. We decided to live quietly, to raise you without spoiling you. We thought it was better that way." He dropped into his chair, staring at the papers as though they might vanish. "I can't believe this. All these years Lena talked about you, struggling, about how we should be helping you, about how hard it must be to get by." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "And what did you believe, Mark?" He rubbed his forehead, avoiding my eyes. "I don't know. I guess I believed her. She always said you never moved on, that you leaned too much on us, that you were jealous of what we built." I let the silence hang between us until he finally looked up. I asked quietly, "Do you love me because I am your mother, or because of what I have?" His face tightened, torn between shame and defense. "That's not fair, Mom. Of course I love you." I held his gaze. "I am asking because it matters. Because for years, I have let you stand silent while your wife humiliated me, while she erased me from my own family. And you let it happen because it was easier." He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his jaw working. The weight of the folder on the desk between us seemed to press down on him. I continued, my tone softer. "I never wanted money to define us. I wanted love to be enough. But now I see that my silence gave her power, and you let her use it." Mark finally whispered, "I didn't know, Mom." "You didn't want to know," I said, my voice sharpening. "It was easier to believe I was weak, that I needed your pity, than to admit you married someone who wanted me out of the picture." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling as if the truth might be written there. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the boy who once ran into my arms after scraping his knee, now a man caught between loyalty and guilt. After a long pause, he said, "I don't know what to do." "You don't have to know yet," I told him. "But you do need to decide who you are. Are you the son who lets his wife push his mother to the ground in front of guests, or are you the man your father hoped you would become?" His throat bobbed as he swallowed. The room was heavy with silence, only the hum of the air conditioner filling the space. I stood and pushed the folder closer to him. "Keep it. Read it. Think about what it means. But know this, Mark. I am not powerless. I am not invisible. And I will not let anyone treat me that way again." His hand rested on the folder, his fingers curling around the edge. He finally whispered, "I need time." I nodded. "Take it. But remember, space goes both ways." I walked toward the door without looking back. My reflection in the glass pane showed a woman standing taller than she had in years. For the first time, the burden of silence had lifted, and though Mark's answer was uncertain, I knew the question had been planted. He would have to face it. Out in the hallway, the receptionist gave me a polite smile, unaware of the shift that had just begun behind the office door. I stepped into the bright afternoon sun and drew a breath that filled my lungs with steadiness. The path ahead was still unclear, but the balance of power was changing, and it had started in that small office with a folder full of truth. I left his office with the echo of his silence still pressing against me, a silence that told me more than words could have. By the time I reached the parking lot, the afternoon sun had dropped low enough to cast long shadows across the pavement, and I sat in my car with the steering wheel cool under my palms. The folder of numbers was no longer mine to carry, but there were other truths waiting to be uncovered, ones that might matter even more when the time came. That evening in my apartment, I pulled out an old spiral notebook where I kept scraps of phone numbers and names. A friend of mine, Pat Owens, had once mentioned hiring a private investigator when her sister's ex tried to hide assets during a divorce. I found the number written in her careful script and dialed it with a steadying breath. The man who answered introduced himself as Tom Harris. His voice was calm, clipped with the faint rasp of someone who had lived years asking hard questions. I explained that I needed background information on a family member, nothing illegal, only public record work. He asked for the name, date of birth, and any aliases. I gave him Lena's full name, her maiden name Cooper, and the few details I knew about her supposed degree and past jobs. He was quiet for a moment, then asked why now. I told him I had spent years letting assumptions define me and that I was done living in shadows. We arranged to meet the next morning at his office near the Maple Grove courthouse. His office was plain, a small suite above a barber shop, the walls lined with filing cabinets and framed certificates. He was in his early 50s, sturdy build, his tie loose around his neck. He gestured for me to sit at a battered oak desk and slid a yellow legal pad in front of him. He asked pointed questions and I answered carefully. How long had Lena claimed her degree? What companies had she named in conversation? Did I know of any prior marriages I gave him? Everything I could remember, even the smallest details. And when we finished, he promised a full report within a week. The waiting was the hardest part. Days stretched with quiet tension. I busied myself with simple routines, cleaning closets, cooking small meals, walking by the lake at dusk when the geese skimmed across the water. But each night, I returned to the thought of Lena's smile as the locksmith handed her the receipt, and each night, my jaw clenched tighter. On the 7th day, my phone rang. Tom's voice was firm. I have something for you. Can you come by? The envelope he slid across the desk was thick, sealed with a paperclip. He did not rush as he spoke. Nothing here is criminal, he began. But it paints a picture. The first pages showed scanned court dockets from Cook County. 2 separate credit card suits filed under her maiden name. Both resulted in judgments. One had been paid through monthly installments, the other satisfied suddenly with a lump sum likely borrowed. The numbers were small compared to the life she pretended, but the pattern was telling. He turned to the next section. Divorce filings, Lake County, nearly 10 years ago. Her husband at the time, David Kellerman, alleged financial abuse accounts opened in his name, manipulation tied to money. No children dissolution, granted property divided modestly. There was even a protective order request dismissed after a hearing. Tom's eyes met mine. Allegations remain allegations, but the themes repeat. The third section cut deepest. A degree verification from State University. No record of a business degree. Attendance noted for 2 semesters, then withdrawal. The claim of graduating had no basis. The resume she polished so often at dinner tables was an invention. He went on calm and thorough. A small marketing contract once in Evanston, no corporate role as she claimed. No property in her name, vehicles leased under Mark's credit, the remodel of their kitchen financed through a company known for high-interest installment loans. I sat still, my breath shallow. The neat pile of evidence told me what I had always sensed but never proved. Her confidence was built on sand. She had stitched together a facade of stability to hide a life of scrambling and debts. Tom closed the folder and slid it back toward me. All public record, all verifiable. Use it wisely. I thanked him and carried the envelope home. On my kitchen table, I laid the documents out one by one. The credit card judgments, the divorce decree, the registrar's note. Each piece added weight to the truth. I remembered Lena laughing about her degree, dismissing me as if she had climbed some ladder I could never reach. I remembered her sneering at my modest clothes, unaware that her designer shoes might still carry balances on revolving debt. I gathered the papers and walked them to my closet, unlocking the fireproof box where Ben's photo rested against the stack of financial statements. I slid the envelope inside and locked it again. My hand lingered on the metal lid. The truth was not meant to be wielded recklessly, but it was a shield I would not hesitate to raise if she tried again to push me down. That night I sat in my armchair, the hum of the refrigerator steady in the background. I thought about Ava, about the joy on her face when she learned her balance was cleared. She did not know the undercurrents swirling around her parents' lives. She did not see the fragile scaffolding Lena had built. Someday she might. But for now it was enough that she knew she was free. I let the stillness settle over me. The old pattern of silence was broken. I had knowledge, power, and a plan forming. The locks Lena changed might have shut me out of that house, but I had opened another door entirely. One she did not even know existed yet. When I finally rose to turn out the lights, I felt the faintest smile tug at the corner of my mouth. Timing would matter, and patience would matter more. But I no longer felt cornered. I felt prepared. And that was a beginning. The knock came earlier than I expected, sharp and urgent against the thin wood of my apartment door. I had been making tea, the kettle still hissing on the stove, when I looked through the peephole and saw Lena standing in the hallway. Her hair was tied back loosely, strands falling around her face, and her usual polish had worn away. There were shadows under her eyes, and her smile when she noticed me watching was thin and brittle. I opened the door only far enough to meet her gaze. She forced a laugh and brushed past me without waiting for an invitation. The scent of her expensive perfume filled the room too heavy for the small space. She looked around at my modest living room, her lips curling as she took in the faded armchair and second-hand bookcase. "So, this is where you spend your time." she said, her tone sweet but edged with disdain. All these years, I thought you were clinging to us because you had nowhere else to go. And I was right. I walked back to the table, calmly letting her words fall into the air without reply. She continued, her voice rising with each observation. This carpet looks like it has been here since the 70s. These curtains, they are depressing. I do not know how you stand it. She touched the arm of my chair with 2 fingers as if it might stain her skin. It is sad, really. You have nothing left. I sat down at the table and met her eyes steadily. She was waiting for me to argue to defend myself, but I stayed quiet. Instead, I reached under the side table for the fireproof box, set it carefully on the wood, and turned the key. The latch clicked open, and the sound cut through her performance like glass breaking. Her laughter faltered. What is that, some kind of keepsake? I pulled out the folder thick with bank statements and investment summaries and slid it toward her. She smirked as she opened it, clearly expecting old photos or sentimental letters. But her expression changed as her eyes moved across the first page. She laughed again, but this time the sound was shaky, brittle. Bank statements, investment accounts. You cannot be serious. I leaned back, watching her fingers flip faster, the numbers sinking in. At first she tried to scoff. $10 million. That cannot be right. This has to be fake. Her voice wavered as she spoke, her cheeks draining of color. She kept turning pages, searching for proof it was a trick, but every document told the same story. Her breath hitched, and suddenly she was silent. The folder sagged in her hands. Why, she whispered finally. Why would you hide this? Why let us think you were broke, that you needed us? I folded my hands on the table. To know who truly respected me, to see who loved me when they thought I had nothing. Her eyes filled with tears, and she pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. You let me humiliate you. You let me call you pathetic. You let me believe I had the upper hand. She shook her head violently. Do you know what this means for me? For Mark. For everyone. I kept my tone even. It means nothing changes about who I am. It only changes what you can no longer say to me. Her tears spilled hot and angry. You made a fool of me. You sat in our house at our table and you let me talk down to you. All the while you were sitting on this. She jabbed at the folder with her finger. I rose slowly and closed the folder, sliding it back into the box. I did not let you do anything, Lena. You revealed who you are. She began pacing my small living room, her shoulders tense, her voice sharp between sobs. You think this makes you powerful. You think Mark will choose you now. Money ruins marriages. It ruins families. It does not ruin them, I said quietly. It reveals them. She stopped in front of the window, her back to me. Her shoulders shook. When she turned, her face was blotchy, her eyes red. Mark does not know the whole truth, does he? He knows enough, I answered. Enough to start seeing clearly. She clenched her fists at her sides. You should have told us. I locked the box with a decisive turn of the key and placed it back under the table. I told you now, I said. That is all that matters. She covered her face with her hands and let out a sound that was part sob, part laugh. She dropped them again and looked at me with raw desperation. I cannot believe this. I cannot believe I am standing in this dump while you sit on more money than I will ever see. I tilted my head slightly. Maybe now you understand why appearances can deceive. For a long moment she stared at me, her chest rising and falling as if each breath cost her. Then she whispered, I need time. I walked to the door and opened it wide. Take all the time you need." She glanced once at the box under the table, then hurried past me into the hallway. Her footsteps echoed against the stairs until the building fell quiet again. I stood there a moment, my hand on the door frame, listening to the silence settle. When I closed the door, the apartment felt lighter, as if the air itself had shifted. I returned to the chair and sat down slowly, my palms flat against my knees. For the first time in years, Lena had been forced to see me as more than an obstacle. She had walked in convinced I was nothing, and she had left knowing I had everything she feared. The kettle on the stove had cooled by then, but I poured the lukewarm water into a mug and held it between my hands, the steam faint but steady. I looked around at my modest apartment, the same walls and furniture she had mocked minutes earlier, and smiled. To me, it had never been about the space. It had always been about respect. And now, at last, the balance had shifted. The ripple effect of that evening stretched out quickly, reaching places I had not expected. Within days, whispers about the locks and Lena's behavior began to circle the neighborhood. I first heard it from Mrs. Kaplan when I passed her on the sidewalk. She leaned in close, lowering her voice as though sharing a scandal from a tabloid. "People on Willow Lane are saying Lena had the locksmith change everything the morning after Ava's graduation. They say she laughed about it. Now they think she looks cruel, not you." She patted my arm with sympathy before walking on, and I felt the words settle deep inside me. For so long I had been the target of whispers, but now those whispers had turned pointing at Lena instead. At the grocery store later that week, I felt eyes on me again. A pair of women from down the street glanced over as I reached for a carton of milk. One muttered something under her breath, and though I did not catch all of it, I heard the word selfish. Their looks carried judgment, but for the first time, it was not aimed at me. My place in the story was shifting, and I did not need to say a word to make it happen. Meanwhile, Mark found himself trapped under the weight of it all. His office in downtown Chicago had always been his escape, a place where numbers made sense and emotions had no room. But one Tuesday afternoon, his manager, Mr. Dawson, pulled him into a glass-walled conference room. "Mark, you are not yourself. You have been distracted late to meetings, and last week you forgot to send out the client reports. That is not like you." Mark tried to protest, but Mr. Dawson cut him off. "I do not know what is happening at home, but it is bleeding into your work. You need to get control of it." When Mark told me this later, his voice was subdued, edged with shame. I could hear the exhaustion in him, the slow realization that defending Lena's choices was draining him in ways he had never admitted. I did not gloat, though part of me wanted to. Instead, I listened knowing the weight of discovery had to settle on him naturally. The shift between them came to a head at dinner a few nights later. Ava told me about it in a hushed call, her voice still trembling from what she had witnessed. They had sat down at the table, plates of roast chicken and green beans in front of them, but the air was already thick with tension. Lena began almost immediately, her words sharp, accusing me of manipulation, of turning neighbors against her, of trying to split their family apart. Ava stared down at her plate, frozen between them, while Mark sat stiffly, his jaw tight. Then, for the first time in years, he spoke without hesitation. "No one has the right to humiliate my mother, not even you, Lena." Ava said the silence that followed was like a bomb going off. Lena's fork clattered against the plate. She stared at Mark as though he had just betrayed her in front of a jury. She stammered, "You are choosing her over me," but he held his ground. "This is not about choosing," he told her. "This is about respect." The words reached me later, but when I heard them, I felt something loosen inside me that had been knotted for too long. I pictured my son no longer a boy tugged between loyalty and fear, but a man finally acknowledging the line that should never have been crossed. The neighborhood gossip only grew. At the bakery, I overheard two women laughing softly as they described Lena's performance with the locksmith. One said she had seen Lena smiling, like she had won a prize when the locksmith left. Another shook her head and muttered, "Poor Nora," and yet the pity was gone from her tone. It was replaced by indignation directed squarely at Lena. The story shifted in subtle but powerful ways. Lena had worked hard to make me look like a burden, but now her own actions had painted her as heartless. She could not control the narrative anymore, no matter how many explanations she offered. One evening, Mark came by my apartment alone. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper, his suit wrinkled as if he had worn it too long. He sat across from me at the table and rubbed his hands together, searching for words. "I wanted you to know," he said finally. "I told her it stops here. No more insults, no more trying to erase you. I do not know what happens to my marriage after this, but I know I cannot keep pretending anymore." I reached across the table and laid my hand over his. His skin was warm, his grip unsteady. For years, I had waited for him to stand up, not for me alone, but for himself. Hearing those words, even with all the uncertainty they carried, was like sunlight breaking through a long gray winter. That night when I sat by the window with the lamplight glowing softly around me, I thought about how far we had come. From the shove on the patio to the locksmith's smirk from neighbors' whispers, to my son finally raising his voice. The tide was shifting. The story was no longer written by Lena's disdain. It was being rewritten by truth, by the evidence of what people had seen and what Mark had finally acknowledged. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I no longer felt like an outsider in my own family's history. I closed the curtains slowly, letting myself breathe in the stillness. Outside, the neighborhood carried on, but behind those doors, the balance of power had begun to change. The sun was warm on my shoulders as I stood at the edge of the driveway in Riverside Heights, the realtor's car pulling away, leaving me with a ring of keys heavy in my palm. For a moment, I just stared at them, the silver edges glinting in the afternoon light, the weight of their promise almost overwhelming. A house mine alone after years of being treated like I had no place at all. Ava rushed ahead of me up the steps, her excitement spilling over in every movement. She pushed open the front door and gasped as though she had stepped into a palace. "Grandma, come look," she called, her voice echoing through the wide foyer. I followed slowly, Patricia at my side, her cane tapping rhythmically against the hardwood. She was smiling in that knowing way only an old friend could eyes soft with pride. Inside the house smelled of polish and new beginnings. Light streamed through tall windows, glancing off the gleaming wooden floors. Ava darted from room to room, her laughter trailing behind her like music. She threw open closet doors, poked her head into bathrooms, and ran upstairs with the boundless energy of youth. Her voice floated back down the staircase. "Grandma, the bedrooms are huge. You could fit your whole apartment into one of them." Patricia chuckled as she eased into a chair near the fireplace. "I never thought I would see you here, Nora," she said. "I remember you pouring coffee in that cramped kitchen of your apartment, telling me you just wanted peace. And now look." She gestured around at the vaulted ceilings, the wide archways. Peace with plenty of room to spare. Sandra, the realtor, walked us through the final details, her heels clicking softly on the floor. She pointed out the renovated kitchen, the sunroom that overlooked the backyard, the finished basement with built-in shelves. When we circled back to the foyer, she tucked the papers into a folder and handed them to me. "Congratulations, Mrs. Whitman. It is officially yours, free and clear." Then with a little smile she added, "With $10 million, you could buy half this neighborhood if you wanted." Her words landed in me like a bell. I closed my eyes for a second, and Lena's face appeared as clear as if she were standing right there. That smirk the morning she changed the locks, her satisfaction, as if she had finally locked me out of my own life. I opened my eyes to the gleam of the keys in my hand and let a quiet smile spread across my lips. The smirk that once cut so deeply had become her own undoing, and now the shame belonged to her. Ava bounded back into the room, her cheeks pink, her eyes shining. "Grandma, this means you never have to go back to that apartment again. You are safe here with space and a garden and neighbors who actually care." She hugged me tightly, her head pressed against my shoulder. I stroked her hair, my throat thick with emotion. We stepped outside into the backyard together. The garden stretched out in neat beds edged with roses and lavender. Beyond it, tall maples swayed gently in the breeze. Patricia joined us, slowly settling into a patio chair with a satisfied sigh. I stood in the middle of the yard, breathing in the scent of grass and flowers, and for the first time in years, I felt the ground steady beneath my feet. This was not just property. It was security. It was dignity. Ava twirled across the lawn, her arms spread wide. "We can plant more flowers, Grandma, or vegetables. Maybe even a swing under those trees." She pointed at the maples, her eyes alight with possibility. The sound of her laughter mingled with the rustling leaves, and I felt something inside me loosen something that had been clenched tight since the day of her graduation party. Patricia leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "You have given yourself more than a house, Nora. You have given yourself proof. Proof that you are not someone they can push aside. Proof that you can stand tall." I nodded, my eyes following Ava as she spun in the grass. Sandra's words lingered in my ears about buying in half the neighborhood if I wished. I thought again of Lena's smug expression, her certainty that she had won when she locked me out. The image twisted now into something else entirely. Her victory had been nothing more than a momentary illusion, already crumbling under the weight of truth. When Sandra finally left, Patricia and I sat together on the back porch, sipping iced tea from glasses she had brought in a small cooler. Ava sprawled on the grass, sketching plans for a garden in her notebook. The late afternoon light painted everything in gold. I looked around, letting myself take it all in. The porch, the yard, the sound of Ava's pencil scratching on the page. "How does it feel?" Patricia asked softly. I turned the keys over in my hand, their metal edges catching the sun. "It feels like I finally have a place that no one can take from me. A place where respect is not begged for, but built into the walls." She nodded, her smile touched with emotion. "And Lena." I let the silence answer, because for the first time I did not need to explain. Lena's triumph had dissolved the moment I stepped into this house. The memory of her smirk at the locks no longer hurt. It only reminded me of how far I had come. That evening, after Ava had gone home and Patricia had left with promises to return soon, I wandered alone through the house. The rooms were quiet, waiting to be filled. I stopped in the kitchen, resting my hand on the cool countertop, then walked upstairs to the master bedroom. The windows looked out over the street where children played on bicycles and neighbors waved to one another. I imagined Lena driving by, seeing me here, knowing this home was mine. I lay down on the bed that first night with the keys still on the nightstand beside me. For the first time in years, I slept deeply without fear of the doors being locked against me. The first winter in Riverside Heights passed quietly, the house settling around me like a protective shell. I filled it with small rituals, mornings spent reading by the sunroom windows, evenings cooking meals I could share with Ava when she visited from the university. The neighborhood became familiar, the mailman greeting me by name, the grocer asking after my granddaughter. Slowly, the ache of being shut out faded, replaced by the steadiness of belonging. Ava thrived at school. She called often, her voice bright with stories about professors who challenged her and friends who made her laugh until her stomach hurt. When she came home on weekends, she dropped her laundry by the door and slipped into the kitchen as though she had always belonged there. She would hug me tightly, whispering thank you for making all this possible, and I would brush her hair back and remind her she had earned every opportunity. Her joy was proof enough that my choices had mattered. Mark's presence was more tentative but growing steadier. He began stopping by the house on his own, sometimes bringing Ava, sometimes just arriving with a bottle of wine and a tired smile. He sat at my dining table, his shoulders heavy, and admitted that the past months had forced him to see things he had avoided for years. At work, his boss had nearly written him off for his distracted performance, but he had managed to turn it around. He was learning slowly that balance was not something Lena could dictate. It was something he had to claim for himself. It was Lena who remained the uncertainty. For weeks she stayed quiet, her calls sharp and short, whenever I answered, until one gray afternoon when she asked to meet. She suggested a cafe near downtown, a neutral place where neither of us held home court. I considered declining, but curiosity tugged at me. She was already seated when I walked in, hands clasped tightly around a cup of coffee gone cold. The once polished perfection of her appearance had slipped. Her hair was tied back hastily, her makeup faint, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. When she looked up at me, it was not with scorn, but with a brittle kind of hope. I sat down without a word, waiting. She cleared her throat and spoke carefully, as though each word were weighed before being released. I know I have hurt you. I know I tried to push you out. The truth is, I was jealous and I was afraid. Afraid of losing Mark. Afraid of never being enough. She paused, swallowing hard. I am not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted to tell you I understand now what I did. I watched her for a long moment. Her confession was not an apology wrapped in excuses. It was raw, stripped down closer to honesty than I had ever heard from her. My voice was calm when I finally answered. I do not need you to love me, Lena. I do not even need you to like me. What I need is respect. And if you cannot give that, then remember this. Poor people can surprise you. The words hung between us. For a heartbeat, I thought she might flare back, but instead, her eyes filled with tears. She nodded, unable to speak. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed smaller, not because she wanted to dominate, but because she had been humbled. We parted with no promises, no sudden reconciliation. She walked out into the drizzle, pulling her coat tighter around her, and I stayed a few minutes longer, breathing in the bitter scent of coffee and release. Months passed, and then came Ava's 19th birthday. I hosted it at my new house, filling the dining room with candles and the kitchen with the smell of roasted chicken. Patricia came, her laughter as loud as ever, and neighbors drifted in with small gifts and warm smiles. Mark arrived early to help me set the table, arranging plates and glasses with a care that spoke louder than his words. When Lena walked through the door, the air shifted. She was quieter dressed, simply offering a cake she had baked herself. Ava hugged her, then hurried off to open presents with her friends. Mark guided Lena into the dining room, and for once she did not take the center of attention. She sat at the edge, speaking softly, watching more than performing. As the evening wound down, Ava leaned close to me, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Grandma now, we know who really has to worry about a place to live, don't we?" Her whisper carried the sting of memory and the triumph of truth. I pressed a kiss to her cheek, my smile calm and certain. Later, after everyone had gone, I stood in the quiet house. The dining table was scattered with plates, the air still warm with laughter. I thought of how far we had come, of the locks that had once shut me out and the doors that now opened wide. I thought of the bruises that had healed the humiliation that had hardened into resolve, and the moment I had decided I would no longer let anyone define my worth. This is what I want you to carry with you. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are the lines that protect your dignity. Respect is not something to beg for. It is something you claim by standing firm. Do not let anyone decide your value for you. If this story has touched you, share your thoughts. Tell me if you have faced something similar, if you have drawn your own lines and discovered your own strength. Leave a comment, let us know where you are listening from, and stay with us for more stories like this. Because when we share them, we remind one another that we are never alone in the fight to be respected.